Hello and welcome to Carpet City Cinema, a Gila Films podcast. I'm David Weaver, and this is our third episode. And just going to kick off right away by looking back at the poll we put up for last week's episode, which asked, of the 3 TV shows that ran for the entire length of the NBC mystery movie run, which one was your favorite? And there are 3 shows that qualify for that: Columbo, McMillan and Wife, and McCloud. And the winner was Columbo, which is a tough call for me, which one I would go with. I think that Columbo and McMillan and Wife are kind of neck and neck. They have different things that make them appealing. You know, we obviously did a deep dive into Columbo last week. McMillan and Wife, the premise of that show is Stuart McMillan, played by Rock Hudson. He's the San Francisco police commissioner, and his wife is Sally, played by Susan St. James. And the other 2 regulars on the show are John Schuck as McMillan, a.k.a. Max, right-hand man, Sergeant Enright, and the wonderful Nancy Walker of Mary Tyler Moore and Rhoda fame, who plays the McMillan's housekeeper, Mildred. And that show has a much more pronounced use of humor than, say, in Columbo, which does, of course, have its own comedy elements to it. But it has that in its core is this incredible chemistry between Rock Hudson and Susan St. James. They are really one of the best on-screen couples I've ever seen, including film and television, both. It's different vibe than what Rock Hudson had with Doris Day, which of course is probably who he's most identified with in terms of like a female co-star. You know, they did the 3 movies together in the late 50s, early 60s. That was kind of different though, because in those movies there tended to be a little bit more antagonism between Rock Hudson and Doris Day's characters. But in McMillan and Wife, I mean, it's incredible how they work together on that show. I mean, it's just completely 200% sell this idea of this couple that are, deeply in love with each other. Sally's constantly getting herself pulled into these mishaps or trying to just, tag along with her husband to be near him. It's just the rapport they have with the supporting cast too. Obviously, John Schuck and Nancy Walker were actor and actress with a lot of comic background. Like we said, Walker was on the Mary Tyler Moore Show and then Rhoda, and John Schuck had been in the feature film of MASH, and did a lot of comic work. Later had the very short-lived comedy police show Holmes and Yo-Yo, but like I said, it's more humor than in the other, NBC mystery shows like McCloud and Columbo, but really great use of San Francisco. I mean, I'm a big fan of shooting in San Francisco at this time period, kind of like I'd say the Bullet with Steve McQueen, the famous cop film, is kind of the high point of catching San Francisco on the screen. But and that was the cool thing too about the NBC mystery movies is they generally were centered in a different locale. McCloud was in New York City, Banachek was in Boston, Columbo, like we said, was in L.A., and McMillan and Wife, San Francisco, and even the Stoop Sisters, which was a short-lived one, which was also set in New York City, but it was kind of like a different vibe of New York City. It was more like the upper class areas of New York City versus like McCloud, which was more like the streets. But McMillan and Wife, it engaged you with the really amazing comic and, depending on who the characters were, romantic interplay that was interwoven throughout the development of the narrative. And I don't want to make it sound like McMillan and Wife is a romantic show or a comedic show in that sense. It is at its heart a mystery show, and in some of the episodes they just really unfolded some truly intriguing storylines. There's one of my favorites is where one of Stuart and Mac and Sally's friends is being plagued by appearances of her husband, who was supposed to have been killed. Another, probably my favorite episode is when Stuart and Sally get pulled into the doings of a cult of devil worshippers, and that's actually the episode set at Halloween time with a great guest cast of like Keenan Wynn and Robert Hooks. So the actual mysteries that are the foundation of each episode, they're often very strong. I think that maybe a little less consistently so than Columbo. I think there is by percentage a stronger mystery writing on Columbo than there might be on McMillan and Wife. There's a couple episodes of McMillan and Wife where they deal with Mac's past involvement in the intelligence, federal government intelligence, and those aren't quite as engaging, the mystery aspects of those episodes, but still, regardless, the humor is always great. The interplay, the exchanges between the cast members, and like I said, it's a different vibe than Columbo, so it's kind of hard to judge which one I like more. So I think that they're just equally good for different reasons. McCloud, we're actually watching that now, my girlfriend and I. We watched all the way through Columbo and McMillan and Wife, and we're a little more than halfway through McCloud. It's definitely a step below the other two. The premise of McCloud being Dennis Weaver stars as Sam McCloud, who's a marshal from Taos, New Mexico, who gets signed. Well, he arrives in New York City to apprehend a fugitive, but then ends up being on assignment there to learn the ways of big city police. And this is stretched out for like 7 seasons or something like that. So, a little suspension of disbelief there. But, again, there's, Weaver's a great actor. Obviously people before McCloud really knew him from Gunsmoke. But if you see him in, the films he did, like, Duel being one of the best examples, just an incredible performance he gives in that movie, a suspense-filled performance. And, similarly in Touch of Evil by Orson Welles. But, he's definitely good in that role as Sam McCloud, who's kind of like, that classic character of fish out of water, but with this backwoods wisdom that always comes in handy. But just in general, McCloud, kind of the episodes have more the bearing of just kind of like standard police detective shows of that era. And also, oftentimes they seem padded. The thing about NBC mystery movie episodes is they have to fill like this, roughly 90-minute, 2-hour time gap. So, McCloud, sometimes you see in the episodes where you can tell like, oh, this was like an hour-long show, this episode, and they had to like throw in something else that really doesn't matter to kind of, pad it out. But again, it's a 70s Universal TV show. A lot of great guest stars, as with all the shows of that time. There's episodes we've seen so far with like Roddy McDowall and Burgess Meredith and Eddie Albert. It's everyone's on board that you want to see from that era, but definitely a step below. And a lot of the other NBC mystery shows, though, they just didn't last very long. They kind of came and went, a season or two. Like I said, Banachek lasted a couple of years, but a lot of them, like Tenafly, Lanigan's Rabbi, Madigan, they just only lasted 1 season. The Snoop Sisters, check that out. That's out on DVD. That only lasted 5 episodes. It's great. It's at the same quality as McMillan and Wife and Columbo, and it's a lot closer, I'd say, in vibe to McMillan and Wife. And the premise of that show is, the great Helen Hayes and Mildred Natwick playing elderly sisters. In New York City, Helen Hayes is a mystery writer, and they constantly get pulled into real life mysteries. And their nephew, played by Burt Convey, who I'm a huge fan of, is a police detective. And then Lou Antonio, who you might remember, Star Trek fans remember him as the alien fending off against Frank Gorshin in the classic Star Trek episode "Let That Be Your Last Battlefield." He plays, they're kind of like their manservant, Barney, in the Snoop Sisters. And again, it only lasted 5 episodes. It was a pilot TV movie, and then 4 episodes after that. But it's just great. You just wish it had lasted longer. There's a phenomenal episode where similar to what happened to McMillan and Wife, where they get pulled into a mystery involving some devil worshippers. But it has Alice Cooper guest starring in that episode. Cyril Richards steals every scene possible. There's another great episode with Vincent Price really leaning on his image, playing a hammy horror movie star accused of murdering his wife. So yeah, definitely check that out. The problem with a lot of the NBC mystery movie shows in terms of catching them is they're not really available. You know, Columbo, McCloud, McMillan and Wife, Snoop Sisters, those are the only ones that were released in their entirety and are still in print. You know, Banachek they put that out, but that's been long out of print. And I picked up Madigan from a label that put it out in France. But yeah, hopefully someone will kind of come and rescue some of the more obscure ones, because I'd love to be able to see those. So, what's been going on with Gila Films since the last episode? Well, we hit a bit of a mark, which is really cool to see on YouTube. Our movie is now officially past 500 views, which is great. So, big shout out to anyone who I heard from a bunch of people who said they went over to the video, watched it, give it a thumbs up, and yeah, continue to do that. That's great. It's great to see that kind of engagement. That's only going to help get YouTube to push that more on its own end for us. So that's awesome. We've just been busy with getting ready for the Blu-ray DVD release. We have less than 2 weeks before we hand off materials to the distributor, so I'm hoping that maybe not next week's episode, but the week after that, we can actually give you the details of who's putting that out. We'll see what they want to do in terms of information rollout. But I've just been putting kind of like the finishing touches on the outtakes reel and deleted scenes and all that fun stuff. So that's coming very, very close. And then just, promoting Carpet City Cinema. And, it's good to see that we've got some people following us on Facebook, engaging with the episode polls, and now we have it up through iTunes. Hopefully we'll add some more platforms when I have some more time to kind of do that. Each platform kind of has its own method of you getting onto their service. So we'll see how that goes. All right, so what's going on in the film industry right now? I wanted to touch on something I wasn't even aware of, is that William Friedkin, the famous Academy Award-winning director who gave us such movies as The French Connection and The Exorcist, The Boys in the Band, he's actually directing a new movie, which is filming as we speak. He's shooting a new version of the Caine Mutiny Court Martial. So if you're not familiar with that, the Caine Mutiny was a novel by Herman Wouk, which centered around the mutiny of a ship towards its captain, Captain Queeg, the original novel was written in 1951, so it was during kind of like the World War II-ish era. And Queeg is a character who is somewhat unstable and is not easily liked by his crew. And so at some point, the crew feels that they need to take over the ship in order to maintain their safety, and this leads to a court-martial trial. Now, the original novel won the Pulitzer Prize, and then Wouk took it and turned it into a stage play. And, of course, it was also made into a very successful film back in 1954. Definitely recommend checking it out. All-star cast with Humphrey Bogart as Queeg. He earned a Best Actor Oscar nomination for that. And it also has one of Van Johnson's best performances. Johnson was often pegged as this kind of like, good-looking boy next door in musicals and comedies, but this film really gives him a chance to show some dramatic chops. It's really a shame he wasn't even nominated for this performance, because he's in the film as kind of the lead the lead officer on the Caine, who feels truly, sincerely that they need to take command away from Captain Queeg in order to maintain their own safety. The play was adapted again in the early 80s as a TV movie, directed by Robert Altman, the famous filmmaker of MASH. And in that version, Brad Davis played Queeg, which is interesting because it's a younger take than you are used to with Bogart. And now it's in production. They're doing a new version, and this time around, Kiefer Sutherland is going to be playing Queeg. And the rest of the cast includes Jason Clarke and the recently just passed away Lance Reddick from the John Wick movies. Friedkin, The Exorcist and The French Connection are great films. French Connection, that's a movie that not only is it a true classic that earns all the accolades it has, but it's also something that's incredibly rewatchable. Sometimes a movie's rewatchability and its greatness aren't necessarily totally on this par with each other. You might have a movie that's blows you away, but it's not something you're going to go to as much as a movie that might not be quite as good, but you just constantly rely on to watch. And The French Connection is one of those rare films that's both highly rewatchable, but also just an incredible piece of filmmaking. And after the success, that was like the back-to-back success, because French Connection was 71, and Friedkin won the Best Director Oscar for that. And then The Exorcist was 73. That was his next movie, got nominated again. And then kind of went through, a period over the next, what should we say, 30-some years where, he consistently worked. But a lot of his films, pretty much most of his films didn't really, hit like those two had. And some of them have been rediscovered in more recent times and given more love. But even at the time they came out, they weren't as well regarded. So you think of stuff like Sorcerer, which was his remake of the famous French film The Wages of Fear, Cruising, the cop movie from 1980, which started Al Pacino as a cop who has to go undercover to find a serial killer among the gay community, and which was controversial when it came out. But there are a lot of films that just, he directed that just did not click with the critics or audiences. He did Deal of the Century with Chevy Chase, which probably a lot of people probably don't even remember that movie. And that was, did not do well at the box office at all. Films like Jade, which was another one of David Caruso's failed attempts to kind of turn his success from NYPD Blue into a feature film career. Movies like Rampage, the 1987 film with Michael Biehn, which, barely even opened. I just finally got to see The Guardian, which is the horror movie he did in 1990 about the the woman who feeds babies to trees, which opened up at number 3 at the box office and kind of was looked at as a return to the genre from the director of The Exorcist, but I don't think exactly blew anybody away at the time it came out, even though again now it has its own kind of following. But then kind of in the mid 2000 aughts. He kind of, or actually, I already say this kind of started in the late 90s, really, because he did the TV movie adaptation of 12 Angry Men, the remake or readaptation of the original teleplay. Obviously, it was a very famous movie with Henry Fonda in the mid-50s, and he did a version in 97 with Jack Lemmon and George C. Scott, which got great reviews. And then in the going into the, like I said, the mid-2000 aughts, he did a couple of these. He started with Bug, which is an adaptation of a Tracy Letts play, and then followed that up with another Tracy Letts adaptation, Killer Joe, in 2011, which were both, both well-regarded movies and kind of, wasn't, I wouldn't put it in the terms of him having a career comeback or a renaissance, like you would think with Robert Downey Jr. in Iron Man, but it was definitely, a step up from everything he'd been doing, and definitely brought some of the best reviews he'd had and gave kind of like new life to the viewpoints on his work. And after that, 2017, after Killer Joe in 2011, it wasn't until 2017 he directed a documentary called The Devil and Father Amorth, which was, basically about the church's, the Catholic Church's exorcist, Gabriel Amorth. Father Gabriel Amorth, whose life is now actually being turned into a narrative horror movie starring Russell Crowe. And that movie, it was like a 68-minute documentary. It was kind of like, wasn't something that you heard tons about. And I kind of wondered if that was just going to be it, if Killer Joe 2011 was going to be like the last narrative film he would do. Then I heard someone the other day talking about, he's got another movie going on, and I checked it out. So that's great to see that he's, still at work. The guy's going to be 88 years old this year. So really interesting to see, how this film comes out, how the people respond to it. It's kind of similar structure, you could say, almost to 12 Angry Men, right? 12 Angry Men's a trial movie where you're with the jury, and the K Mutiny court-martial is, an actual, you're in the courtroom in this naval courtroom. So it's definitely a territory that he's had familiarity with in the past. And, I just love to see these directors, these directors from kind of like that new Hollywood era of the 1960s and 70s, when directors were given such creative freedom and turned out some really great work. Unfortunately, it kind of led to a lot of excess on those directors' parts, which kind of caused them to be reined in. But, Friedkin, just from The French Connection, The Exorcist, lyricist already has, incredible legacy. And so it's always refreshing to see someone from that era continuing to work his craft. And he's a phenomenal conversationalist. If you ever get a chance, check out the his guest appearance on Mark Maron's podcast. It's like a 3-hour episode, but he's just incredibly a rich person to talk with. And also, the famous conversation he has with Nicholas Refn on YouTube, where they talk about a film, and Refn talks about Drive as like one of the greatest films ever made, his own film, and Friedkin kind of cuts him down to size. That's hilarious. That being said, he does some of the worst commentary tracks ever. He's one of those directors who, when you listen to his audio commentaries on movies, he's just telling you what's going on the screen. So it's. But hey, you know what? If you direct The French Connection, we'll give you a pass on the commentary tracks. So that's cool to see that. A couple interesting releases were announced. One of the ones that kind of speaks personally to me is Kino Lorber is putting out another volume of Audie Murphy Westerns on Blu-ray. So if you're not familiar with Audie Murphy, he was the most decorated soldier of World War II. He came from a really rough background. He was born to a really poor Texas farm family back in 1925. He was one of 12 children. The father abandoned the family. Murphy eventually, served during World War II, and like I said, became the most decorated soldier of the war, American soldier of the war, and really wanted to make a career out of it, the military, but an injury that he received curtailed that. But he was given the Congressional Medal of Honor. Incredibly heroic exploits. So the war ends, and James Cagney, actually, of all people, becomes interested in developing Murphy into an actor. And they never ended up. Cagney never ended up casting Murphy in anything, because this was a time at which Cagney and his brother William Cagney were actually producing movies. But this led to him, Murphy, beginning to get some acting lessons. He made his film debut in a small part in the movie Beyond Glory, which was an Alan Ladd film, and had another bit part in another movie called Texas, Brooklyn, and Heaven, which was directed by William Castle, of all people, the future Schlockmeister of House on Haunted Hill fame. And it was around this time that Murphy wrote his autobiography, To Hell and Back, which he wrote with a guy named David McClure. And then got his first lead role in a kind of a roughly juvenile delinquent criminal movie called Bad Boy with Lloyd Nolan and Jane Wyatt. And then 1950 is when he teamed up with Universal Pictures, which is where he spent the bulk of his career at. And he was really known for Westerns there. The first Western he did was playing Billy the Kid in the movie The Kid from Texas. But while he was there, again, most of his stuff was Westerns, but he also ventured out into some other genres. He did a boxing movie, did comedy, but he also finally in 1955 starred in an adaptation of his autobiography. And originally didn't want to play himself in the movie. He didn't want to come across like he was profiting off his experiences, but was convinced to do it. And that movie was actually the most successful film that Universal Pictures had released up till that time. And while Murphy was doing this, he also appearing in these films at Universal. He was also working with some directors at other studios occasionally. He was in John Huston's The Red Badge of Courage, which had a very troubled production, but is a really good movie, still highly regarded. He worked with Joe Mankiewicz in The Quiet American, Huston again in The Unforgiven in 1960. Getting into the 60s, he started branching out into some lower budgeted westerns. He continued to make stuff at Universal, but he was also doing some definitely lower tier films as well. Never Z-grade stuff, nothing like that. But and he also had his own TV show, Whispering Smith, a Western TV show that ran briefly, 1 season long. And then by like the mid to late 60s, he really kind of pretty much brought the acting to an end. His last starring role was a Western, a movie called 40 Guns to Apache Pass. Came out in 1967, and he made one more film appearance, kind of a cameo essentially in a film called A Time for Dying, which he also co-produced, and which was a really troubled production of film that barely got released, although they now just did put it out on Blu-ray. He struggled a lot with a lot of personal demons, PTSD, obviously, from his wartime experiences, gambling issues, financial issues. But he had a really, very unique screen presence. It was very very different. And I noticed it right away because I remember when I was a kid, they were talking about Audie Murphy on AMC back when AMC showed old movies. And they were going to have a marathon for his birthday. And I don't know when this was. This was probably like, I don't know, I was in like probably middle school, high school. And they were going to show his movies all day long. And so I literally got the tapes together and taped like 12 Audie Murphy movies. I remember the first one was on at 6 in the morning, all the way till the nighttime. And the first one they showed was The Duel at Silver Creek from 1952, which is a movie he did, the first of two movies he did with Don Siegel, the famous director of Dirty Harry and Invasion of the Body Snatchers. And right from the outset, he just had such a unique way of delivering his lines, of his own physical presence in a movie. I'm not going to say that he was a great actor. He definitely had his limitations, but he brought something very unique to his performances. When you see him in stuff that has more humor in it, whether it's an outright comedy like a movie he did called Joe Butterfly, which is a service comedy, or even in like The Duel at Silver Creek, he has some good comic moments. He just has this, again, a really unique, very effective delivery, responding to humor. And he really appealed to me, that with his life story, which was obviously a one of a kind for an actor. It seemed like to come and bring with him, and even his westerns. A lot of them are good films. No Name on the Bullet is probably one of his most famous westerns, of which he was the star. Movie in which he actually plays. You don't want to say a bad guy, but he plays a hired gun. Usually he was cast in more of the traditional good guy roles, but in No Name on the Bullet, he plays a hired gun who comes into a small town and no one knows who his target is, who he's there to kill, which starts bringing out a lot of paranoia among the townspeople. And that film has been considered kind of like a forerunner to some of the spaghetti westerns, the darker spaghetti westerns that would come out the next decade. I'm a big fan of films he did, like Posse from Hell, Seven Ways from Sundown. Definitely a lot of that stuff in the mid 50s into the early 60s are some of his strongest work. And again, when he was able to work with a director like John Huston on The Red Badge of Courage, and then later in The Unforgiven, which he had a supporting role playing Burt Lancaster's brother, that's some of his best work as an actor. And it would have been nice to see him work with more of those kinds of directors who maybe were able to bring out richer performances from him. He did work with some really good directors on some of the more B-level westerns he did. Like I said, Siegel, No Name on the Bullet that I was just talking about, that was directed by Jack Arnold, the famous science fiction director, and did a couple films with Bud Bedecker, who was a really known western director who did a lot of stuff with Randolph Scott. But yeah, I'd say that overall, some of those earlier Universal westerns are definitely a little rougher, a little more pedestrian in terms of plot and directing. Now, this set that Kino Lorber just announced, these are all going to be Universal titles. So they already released Volume 1, which included No Name on the Bullet, which I keep referring to, Ride a Crooked Trail, in which Murphy was paired with Walter Matthau, and it also included The Duel at Silver Creek, which I had mentioned, which was directed by Don Siegel, which is a fun film. That is one of his earlier movies, but it's a fun movie because it kind of really plays on almost like the Pulp Fiction aspect of westerns of that time. It has characters named Johnny Sombrero, and so it definitely kind of leans into that. So that's a fun one. And they had already released some Murphy films as single releases too, which they've, I believe the Kino Lorber, felt were going to be stronger selling titles, like obviously Night Passage, which is the one in which he plays Jimmy Stewart's brother. So that was one of his, more high profile Universal Westerns. And some other ones that Kino Lorber has put out as well. So Volume 2, this is going to be all 50s Universal titles, and they've already said at Kino Lorber that they're also going to do a Volume 3, which will be 3 60s titles. But the three titles on Volume 2 are Sierra, Destry, and Kansas Raiders. Now, Frank Tarzi, who is head of acquisitions at Kino, had already told people ahead of time, when we come out with like Volume 2, just be aware that they're not going to be some of the more desirable Murphy titles. And I'm guessing that's because they're probably picking titles that they already had high definition masters for. That's the thing with like Universal Pictures is some movies they have high def masters for, and some they don't. That you have to go and pay to make that happen, which of course cuts into your profit margin. And Kino Lorber has released a number of these actor sets. The Cary Grant collection, the Carol Lombard collection, the Deanna Durbin collection, and they've been up front that a lot of them haven't sold that well. These actor sets, with Murphy being one of the exceptions. So they decided to continue with that line. They also said that the Western collections, they did, I think, 2 Western sets that they also said didn't do that great, which were non-Murphy films. But it seems that like Audie Murphy in a Western is kind of the exception to both rules. And, I've seen these 3 movies, and I agree they're not, his highest work, but definitely will be still something to get because it's just, I'm just a really big fan of his. Sierra is an interesting film because it's the only movie that Murphy made with his first wife, Wanda Hendricks, who is an actress who is probably best known for being in the film noir Ride the Pink Horse. And, has a really good supporting cast in Sierra. It has a Dean Jagger, Burl Ives, a very young Tony Curtis, and James Arness. And then Kansas Raiders, that kind of takes on the whole story of, if you're familiar with it, of Quantrill's Raiders. William Quantrill, who is kind of like this guerrilla Raider Confederate officer during the Civil War. And in this movie, Murphy plays Jesse James. That's the first of the 2 times he played that character. Again, surrounded by a good supporting cast. Tony Curtis is in this one also. Richard Long plays Frank James. James Best is on hand. And then the third movie, Destry, that's a remake of Jimmy Stewart's classic Western, Destry Rides Again from 1939. Although they're based actually on a book. The original source material for that is a book by Max Brand. And in this version, Murphy gets the Stewart role, and he's surrounded by, again, stellar supporting cast. It's got Thomas Mitchell, Mary Wicks, Wallace Ford. So, these veteran character actors. Again, though, I was never... I was never a big fan of Destry Rides Again, even though it's considered a classic, the original with Jimmy Stewart. And having Murphy in the role doesn't really, doesn't make the situation terribly much better for me. But again, they may not be the most desirable Murphy titles, as was forewarned by Kino, but still they're entertaining, they're enjoyable. I'd say of the 3 of them, I don't know. It'd be Sierra or Kansas Raiders. They're kind of close to each other in terms of quality. Which one is the better one? But it's definitely good to pick these up. I would love to get all his movies on Blu-ray eventually. I'm interested to see what they come out with the '60s releases because I feel like in that, again, like I said, in that era, kind of going into the later half of the '50s, going into the early '60s at Universal, there was some really good stuff he was doing then. So I'm definitely curious to see what they do with the next volume. They also announced over at Kino Lorber that they're going to be putting out on Blu-ray from a 4K scan, Elia Kazan's The Last Tycoon. This was the last movie directed by Elia Kazan, who was the famous 2-time Oscar-winning director of such films as Streetcar Named Desire, On the Waterfront, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, Gentleman's Agreement, America, America, East of Eden. And this was his final effort, even though he lived for decades after its release. And it's based on F. Scott Fitzgerald's final work, which was an unfinished novel. And I'm a fan of Fitzgerald's writing, The Great Gatsby, and I'm a big fan of a short story he wrote called A Diamond as Big as the Ritz. And this novel is about a film producer named Monroe Starr, who was modeled after a real-life film producer, Irving Thalberg. Thalberg was a boy wonder producer, especially at MGM, known for just being incredibly successful with the films and projects he brought to the screen. He was married to Norma Shearer, who was a huge film star at the time, but then sadly died at age 37 from pneumonia. And The Last Tycoon took its cues from his life. And to make the film, Harold Pinter, the famous playwright, was brought on to write the screenplay. An incredible cast was assembled for this movie. I mean, Robert De Niro, Jack Nicholson, Teresa Russell is in it, old hands like Ray Milland, John Carradine, and Dana Andrews, and Robert Mitchum. But at the time that it came out, at the time that The Last Tycoon was released, it didn't really meet with the kind of acclaim that people's expectations been reserved for it. Considering all the talent that was going into it. It was also produced by Sam Spiegel, who had brought to the screen On the Waterfront with Kazan, but also The African Queen and Lawrence of Arabia and Bridge on the River Kwai. And it came out in 76 and did not do well at the box office at all. But in later years has been kind of given some more reassessment. I know that some more positive reassessment. I know that Leonard Maltin, the film critic, is a big fan of it. And up to this now, it's only been on DVD, at least here in the States. So I've never seen it, but it is one that I really wanted to check out. I mean, Kazan, he was pretty much on a roll from the first film he directed, the first feature he directed, which was A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, which came out in 1945, all the way up until America, America, which came out in 63, which earned nominations for Best Picture and Director. And then his next couple films after that really didn't fare that well. He did The Arrangement in 69, which was based on a novel he had also wrote. It was a Kirk Douglas film. And then a very small film he did in 72 called The Visitors. And then The Last Tycoon, of course, is a return to a much bigger budget. But, again, he lived till 2003, Kazan did. And this was his swan song. It just, I don't know if there were other projects he was pursuing and wasn't able to get them off the ground, but this would end up being the final film he made until he passed away in 2003 at age 94. So, yeah, Kino Lorber, knocking out the park there with some Audie Murphy and Ilya Kazan. So just want to give a shout out real quick to something of a more altruistic nature. Sadly, saw on Facebook the other day, posted that Eric Edwards, also known as Rob Everett, who was one of the big stars of the golden age of adult films in the 70s, and was also a director, that he's suffering from early onset dementia. So, I mean, if you're not familiar with the history of adult cinema, when you hear about adult films, porn films, you usually think about them in the context, a lot of people, of the content that's out now, stuff that's just, cheaply produced on the internet. But in the kind of that golden era of the 70s, these were films that were treated much closer to, in terms of their production, to normal film, mainstream films. They had actual production value, sets and scripts and scores, and crews on these films would work on non-porn films, on non-adult films. They kind of moved back and forth. It was a different era than the one that we have now as a result of the digital age of filmmaking, and even before that, the VHS era, being able to shoot on video, that obviously had a big impact on all cinema, but adult cinema especially. But Rob Everett, which is the name you kind of see him kind of use most frequently, he's a pretty vocal, active person on social media in terms of talking about his history in the industry and engaging with people. I've seen him through posts on the Vinegar Syndrome Facebook group, obviously, because Vinegar Syndrome, apart from releasing numerous genre films, is also known for their devotion to restoring adult cinema shot on film. So I've seen him about a lot, and yes, someone posted the other day that he is starting to suffer from dementia, which is really sad to see. There is, should you be so inclined, a way of helping him out. You can help him out with some of his medical bills. They're setting up via his PayPal address, which is Rob Everett, that's one word, ROBEVERETT, at sbcglobal.net. To just, if you could chip in $1 or $2, $5 just to help with his medical expenses. He is in his 70s. And, again, just really wish him the best. We chipped in some money to him. And, if you think of it, you could do the same, or just spread the word about that. It'd be much appreciated. And he made some non-adult films, too. He appeared in the 80s slasher film The Prey. I believe he was in Teenage Hitchhikers. And while we're on sad news, also just saw that we lost Michael Reeves, who was a screenwriter, died at age 72 from Parkinson's. Reeves is, if you look at his filmography, which was most of it in TV animation, I mean, this guy wrote for literally every iconic animated show of my childhood. So just reading off a list of the shows he wrote for, Challenge of the GoBots. He wrote for both droids and Ewoks, the two 80s Star Wars animated shows. My Little Pony, The Transformers, Gem, The Littles, The Smurfs. He wrote for He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. He wrote for the Flash Gordon 80s animated show. He wrote for Gargoyles. He wrote for The Real Ghostbusters, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and he won an Emmy for his work on Batman the Animated Series, and also co-wrote the feature film that spun off from that, Batman: Mask of the Phantasm. So just this incredible career, which many people my age will know just from their childhood, all the stuff he wrote for. He also wrote for some live-action shows too, like the 90s Flash, Star Trek The Next Generation, the 80s Twilight Zone reboot. He wrote for some comic books too, wrote some fiction, some Star Wars novels. So yeah, just Emmy Award-winning writer there, who was definitely a part of my childhood. So sorry to see that he passed on from that fight with Parkinson's. All right, so going to move on now, close out with a discussion of a movie I watched last night. First time watch, 1983, the Mike Nichols movie Silkwood. So if you're not familiar with the true story that is the basis for this film, Karen Silkwood was a worker at an Oklahoma-based nuclear fuel production facility where they made plutonium pellets. And this was in like the early 70s. She started to work there in 72. And she was very active in the local union at the place she worked. She was very vocal and drawing attention to the various safety hazards that she observed at this place. She herself was exposed to plutonium contamination while working there. And this culminated in 1974 with Silkwood planning to meet with a New York Times reporter with some documentation she had that would prove the degree to which the company she worked for, Kerr McGee, that would prove the degree to which they were culpable in jeopardizing the safety of their workers. And on the way to this meeting with this reporter, she died in a car accident. And there's been some speculation as to whether or not foul play was involved with that, despite the official ruling that it was just a single car accident. So 1983, Mike Nichols, director of The Graduate, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, brings this story to the screen with the first of his 4 collaborations with Meryl Streep. She would take on the role of Silkwood. And they, of course, would go on from here to do Postcards from the Edge and Heartburn and then the miniseries Angels in America. And he rounded out the cast, the star cast, with Kurt Russell playing her boyfriend, Karen Silkwood's real-life boyfriend, Drew Stevens. And to put this in context of Russell's career at the time, this is really like, as an adult actor, probably, for a theatrically released film, as an adult actor, this is his real big dramatic debut. Because up to, of course, we all know he started out as a child actor. He did a lot of stuff on TV, a lot of stuff with Disney throughout the 60s and 70s. Did definitely show off his chops as an actor in TV movies like The Deadly Tower, in which he played real-life sniper Charles Whitman, and of course John Carpenter's Elvis, which he earned an Emmy nomination for. And then you're going into the 80s, and he and Carpenter, of course, take it to the big screen starting with Escape from New York, and of course he had worked with Robert Zemeckis on the comedy Used Cars, so he was already showing himself as a leading man in feature films, progressing past that child actor stage. But definitely, those are comedy or genre films, and Silkwood was really the chance to show off his abilities in a dramatic part as an adult actor on the big screen. And then Cher was cast as Silkwood and her boyfriend's roommate. Their roommate, Dolly. And like Russell, this was a big dramatic opportunity for Cher, too. The prior year, she had been in a Robert Altman film, Come Back to the Five and Dime, Jimmy Dean. But really, other than that, she had just been focusing on the music career. So this was a huge dramatic opportunity for her. And as for Streep, she was kind of a pretty good role at this point. She had just prior to this done Sophie's Choice, which won her second Oscar. I'm not sure if I have to check the timeline if she actually had won the award by the time Silkwood came out, because Sophie's Choice was 82 and Silkwood was 83. But she had already, prior to that, even won her Oscar for Kramer versus Kramer for supporting actress. She had done The French Lieutenant's Woman, The Deer Hunter, Holocaust on TV. So definitely she was really building that really strong foundation for the rest of her career, where she's kind of been defined as like the premier American actress of our era. And just the film is like ridiculous supporting cast in this movie. Some of whom were just starting out at this time. But if you just look at the supporting cast in Silkwood, it's crazy. It's got David Strathairn, young David Strathairn is one of her coworkers. Future Academy Award nominee Fred Ward plays another one of the coworkers. Craig T. Nelson plays this kind of like lecherous jerk of a coworker. Diana Scarwood gives an incredible performance as Cher's girlfriend in the film. Definitely would have loved to even have more scenes with her in it. But yeah, M. Emmett Walsh is in the movie, and Bruce McGill, and Bill Cobbs shows up briefly, and Tess Harper has a small part. Will Patton's in there really briefly. So it's just this incredible array of really well-known character actors, many of whom are kind of in the infancy of their film careers. But the film, it's interesting because you're not really supposed to go into a film with any expectations, right? I mean, people always say it's best to go into anything of art, any form of art, without any expectations of what it's going to be, how good it's going to be, what it's going to be like. But the reality is that as a human being, that's impossible, because even if you have no expectations, then that itself is an expectation, right? So it's like you're going to bring something to the viewing of the movie. And I honestly was under the impression that this was going to be, especially when you look at the poster, right, for the movie, the original poster for it, which is, Meryl Streep in a car looking over her shoulder to like headlights in the rear view mirror. And it's got the tagline on the poster, on November 13th, 1974. Karen Silkwood, an employee of a nuclear facility, left to meet with a reporter from the New York Times. She never got there. Shout out to my sister, by the way. She was born on November 13th. But anyways, there's just this. And if you watch the trailer for the movie too, the theatrical trailer, you're kind of left with this impression kind of going into it. It's going to be more of a kind of like expose suspense film, and what you get really is more a portrait of blue collar life of Karen Silkwood as this person who. She was an activist. She was someone who spoke out on behalf of safety and labor rights, but she also was, a person dealing with loneliness, a person dealing with, difficult relationships with her, having her children be with her ex, her 3 kids be with her ex, and having to deal with that, dealing with the, ups and downs of her friendship with Cher's character. It's really more a character study of this, the life of a blue collar worker who also happened to speak on behalf of these safety issues, who also happened to speak on behalf of labor issues, who also happened to die this death that some people find suspicious. The kind of the tragic and suspicious end to her life isn't really what the focus of the film. It's really just a chapter of it. And it's an interesting, because when you go into the movie, I wasn't expecting that, but I found that, especially since I work in, I am a blue collar worker. I work at a warehouse. That I found it, interesting to kind of just see this very deliberate, very slow, but assuredly paced unraveling of the story of just a blue collar worker who, just her interactions with her coworkers, disagreements with management, frustration with the position she's working, or whether or not she's getting enough overtime, or can she get off enough time to be with her kids, And then as the story progresses throughout the movie, then you start weaving in the elements of her awareness of safety issues at the plant and her engagement with those issues to speak up about them. But it's interesting because the portrait that I was left with of this person wasn't so much of like this crusader for workers' rights, which, again, you kind of bring that with you to the film, that you're like, oh, this is going to be about, dangerous work site safety and this woman who's about to, speak truth to power and died for it. It was instead, like I was saying, much more a portrait of a woman, a blue-collar woman worker in this type of facility, in this part of the country at this time, who also happened to engage in this kind of workers' rights fights. And, having again, like I said, having worked in a kind of like industrial environment, a blue collar environment, it's interesting because sometimes people will speak up about the working conditions that they see around them and be really concerned, and truly feel that deeply. Other times you'll have people talk about you know the same topic matter, but it's really more like just to make conversation. It's really just kind of like surface level. And I don't say that to judge or anything. I'm just saying, like, sometimes people, they're concerned about, whether or not their pay is fair, another whether or not management is advocating for their safety. And it doesn't really get much more beyond just talking about it. It's just a way of either venting or just to have a conversation. And with Silkwood, the movie, it never really, in its portrayal of this character, never really leans one way to the other about where Karen Silkwood feels about things. Like, is she truly deep down a true passionate believer, like someone who, if she switched from this job to a job at a completely different line of work where she would still be very active in workers' rights, or if she got fired, if she would, from her job, she would run for Congress or something like that to advocate workers' rights? Or is she just someone to whom this is something else for her to do at her job? It's something she learns a little bit about, so about the dangers they're facing at the job site, and she sees how it affects people near her, and it becomes more like just something to add into her life, something she can get involved with because it's something to do, something to talk about, and maybe it's not something that she feels for on a deeper intellectual level. And I don't know if that was their intention or not, to kind of be so undefined about it. It's definitely what, having worked with these people like this, it's what I came away with which is this kind of like amorphous depiction of her character. Like, we're not gonna put our stakes down as to whether Karen Silkwood is truly an idealist or she's a worker who's doing this more because it's something to do. It's something that occupies her. Much in the same way that, having known a lot of people who, do volunteer work. Some people do volunteer work because they truly care about the organization they're involved with. Some people do it because they're truly involved about the cause. And some people do it just because, it's something to do. They like hanging out with their friends, or, it's something to occupy their time. They don't like just being at home, and that's fine. There's again, this isn't none of this is in the context of saying that one is worse than the other. But I think that with the film Silkwood, it's interesting that they, and again, maybe this is just what I get from it, that they decided to kind of chart this path in terms of showing her story. That they would just say, all right, here she is. This is what she's doing, but we're not going to really so much completely lay out her psychology of why she is the way she is. I think that the depiction of her character is very believable. I mean, the choices she makes, the things she does. Obviously, you could say, well, of course, it's a true story, but still, to communicate that from, something that really happens to the big screen, that's not, it's not a given that that's going to work, that things are going to be successfully translated. And also, by the time this film was made, she had, been more than 10 years gone. Almost 10 years gone. So it's not like, making a film where you have that person, true life film, where you have that person to actually talk to, or and kind of, get their input on the film you're making. But I thought that just the depiction of the kind of life where, just kind of living life day to day, just trying to get by, especially in this kind of, industrial blue collar setting, it's very accurate. It's very real. And a lot of that, a big part of that obviously goes to the three leads. I think that you can't say enough about how good the Streep and Russell and Cher are in this movie. They completely disappear into these characters. And, obviously, Streep is very well recognized for what she does. And Cher as an actress, as a dramatic actress, the parts she does in films such as, Mask or Moonstruck, which she won the Oscar for, even though hasn't built as quite a larger filmography, there came a kind of like a point, I think, in the going into like the mid 90s-ish, later 90s-ish, where she kind of pulled back on that kind of stuff, where she hasn't quite built the same filmography for herself that Streep did, but still she is highly regarded as a dramatic actress. But Russell, he's got such chops. He's got such skills as an actor. And I don't think he gets enough credit for that. There are people who appreciate that, obviously, like, Tarantino has cast him in several things. But I mean, this guy's a really good dramatic actor. I mean, he's good at everything. I mean, Russell is good as an action actor. He's good in genre films. He's good at comedy. I mean, take a film like Big Trouble in Little China, which is a multi-genre film where he's handling all those things, humor and action all in one character. I mean, he's just incredible in that film. But even when you see him play a role like he did in Grindhouse, Quentin Tarantino's section of the anthology film Grindhouse, the Death Proof section in which he plays a homicidal stunt driver. I mean, he's playing, a really evil person in that film, and it's just completely believable. I mean, he has such range, but I think he kind of, I don't know, he kind of gets pegged into this kind of like, I feel like B plus A minus action movie star kind of role. I mean, I feel like even though he obviously was in several films which are successful, and obviously Stargate spawned the whole franchise on television, and his work with John Carpenter, of course, is well known, even though some of it, like The Thing, wasn't successful at the time. I still feel like there's this degree to which he never quite had like the big franchise that like a Stallone or a Schwarzenegger had, and he didn't have enough of these parts like Silkwood to totally sell himself to people as the really strong dramatic actor that he was, even though he would occasionally pop up in stuff like Vanilla Sky. And I just have a huge respect for his career because he's kind of like, I look at him like the flip side of the Jodie Foster coin, right? I mean, they're like, he's the guy, she's the girl. They both started as child actors. They both were big at Disney back when they were growing up. And they really transitioned into these really successful careers, different paths, obviously. Foster, she kind of almost immediately found success transitioning out of the Disney world into stuff like Taxi Driver and The Little Girl Who Lives Down the Lane, but then kind of went through this kind of rough period throughout the 80s until she won the Oscar for The Accused. Where she almost was going to leave acting behind. And since that, of course, is, well regarded and also is directed. And Russell, his path was a little different because, he kind of, again, came out of the Disney world and, the TV movie parts and, hit it off with Carpenter and did stuff like Silkwood, but then kind of, I think, into the 90s kind of and into the early 2000s, it was difficult for him to, I think, cement himself as either the go-to dramatic actor who we can hand him any role and he can really handle it, even though he had those abilities. And he also couldn't cement himself as the guaranteed box office action movie star either. It's like he couldn't find his niche in either world. And now, in later years, he's kind of getting some recognition as more like a character actor with his work with Tarantino and stuff like Bone Tomahawk. But they have these connections, both of them, he and Foster, to, the Hollywood past, because they were, it's like people have talked about, Russell was a kid at Disney. So, he worked with Walt Disney, and he was surrounded by all those people who were at the studio at the time and working on shows like Lost in Space and Gilligan's Island. And, his first movie was an Elvis movie. And likewise, Foster, early in her career, I mean, just the tiniest kid, she's in stuff like, Mayberry RFD and the Doris Day Show. So they were surrounded by all these old Hollywood people who they grew up around and worked around and then transitioned into like leading actor and actress in our contemporary time. So they have such a connection to the past that I really respect. And especially with like Russell, his father was a character actor, Bing Russell, especially known for Westerns. So, Russell's connection goes back even further through that. But again, the big strength in Silkwood, to get back to that, the big strength in Silkwood is really those three performances. Of Streep, Cher, and Russell, and everyone else, of course, is really good. As again, special attention to Diana Scarwood. She's got these great bitchy back and forth moments between her and Russell, where it comes to the point in the film where she starts dating Cher, and she's rooming in the same house with Kurt Russell and Meryl Streep and Cher, and there's always this antagonism between her character and Russell's. I could have watched the whole movie of just those two going at it. Now, all this being said, this was a solid film, and like I said, it's incredible acting and a unique take on presenting this kind of character, which again went against my expectations. Um, that being said, I don't know that what keeps it from being a great movie, right? Because it's not. To me, it's not. It's not a great movie. I wouldn't call this a great film. I wouldn't call, oh, it's such a very good film. It's solid. It's solid. And it was, very well regarded at the time. Did well at the box office. Nominated for several Oscars. Both Streep and Cher were nominated. Mike Nichols was nominated. The screenplay and the editing were also nominated. I think part of the problem is that first off, that it could be trimmed a little bit. Obviously, there's a fine line here where you're trying to show this person's life, the day-to-day grind, in a way to show what her existence is like and to bring you into her world. But I think it spends a little bit too much time with that. I mean, it's a 130-minute movie roughly, and you don't really start seeing these elements of her activism kind of really start bringing in until like the halfway point. Those don't start coming into the halfway point. So I think they could have tripped a tiny bit, even if it was just 10 minutes off the front end. The other thing, and I've been trying to process this since I watched it, so I don't know, these aren't the fulliest of formed thoughts, but and I wouldn't want this to come across the wrong way, but also I don't want to spend all night trying to figure the right way to say it. Everybody's life has its interest. Everybody's life has its dramatic interest. Karen Silkwood's life obviously has dramatic interest with what happened to her. But there's a lot of things that kind of define who she is as we know her, that define the character of Karen Silkwood as we know her, that are kind of like very vague. Like if she had a big part of Karen Silkwood's identity and the social conscious is her death. That she died in a car accident to which there is some suspicion attached. But even a lot of that's vague, right? I mean, she died in a one-car accident. And this isn't spoiler territory because it's a true life story and everyone knew what happened. So if you're not familiar with this Karen Silkwood story, maybe you don't want to listen to this part. But I mean, it is a true story, so spoilers ahead. But, she died in this car accident, and it was ruled as a one-person accident. They found some tranquilizers in her system and some alcohol. And it was more than, I think, the tranquilizer. It was a heavy amount. So the police just ruled it as a one-car accident, that she went off the road, fell asleep, whatever. But apparently people also found rear damage on her car, which would indicate that somebody hit her from behind. And people who knew her said that, she had none of that damage on her car prior to the time that, this incident happened. And also that when she left for this meeting with a reporter, that she had documentation she was going to use, notes, and that was not found at the scene. So there's this vagueness to her death, like, was it really anything more than just a car accident? And if you take that out of her story, then what do you have? If you remove the car accident from the life of Karen Silkwood, then you have the story of someone who was an activist who obviously fought for these different issues. But is it, and maybe this is all subjective, but is it a necessarily compelling story that needs to be told? The story of, this worker who, lived this existence of like I said, the blue collar grind, and then became active in the social work aspect of the blue collar existence, championing for workers' rights and whatnot. And then it never really got beyond that, because that's what you'd have if you take out the car accident. And then when you look at the stuff that she was championing for, obviously I'm a huge workers' rights person, having worked so long in industrial settings and stuff. And, some of the things that she was lobbying for in the film and in real life, needed to be done. Obviously common safety things, the ability of workers to not feel like management's trying to censor them. But I don't know that that's necessarily the meat of a story that needs to be told. It's kind of like the difference between, are you going to show a movie, like if you could do a movie about a police officer, right? There's always a certain dramatic interest to that, the day-to-day life of a police officer. But suppose all you showed being a movie about a police officer and all you showed was them just on patrol. And maybe the most that happened on patrol was that you know pulling people over for speeding or quieting somebody who's being a public nuisance. I don't know if that would necessarily call itself to being material of that needs to be made into a movie. Not unless you could bring a voice to it, a voice to it that speaks to the everyday kind of routine matters. I'm not saying that every story has to be hit 12 out of 10 on the dramatic scale. I'm not saying that every police movie has to be about serial killers and armed robberies, or that every film about a blue collar worker needs to be about they're working at a plant that's about to blow up, or conspiracies involving management. I love the stuff that's just day to day grind. And movies that kind of focus on that. I mean, there's countless movies like that I love. I'm a big fan of one of my favorite documentaries, phenomenal documentary from the 70s that maybe I'll revisit and talk about more in depth sometime, called Derby, which is all about, it parallels the day-to-day kind of existence of a champion roller derby player and this kid who works at a blue-collar job, a really young guy who dreams about being a derby champion, but really is kind of just like this driftless, aimless kid. That film is just fascinating just to watch this routine conversations of these characters, these real life people, and day to day, the day to day happenings. But the reason that film is so successful to me is because it really channeled the mindset that these two people had in that documentary, and it really it was a very compelling look at these two people who had a similar interest but completely different paths, even in just their day-to-day decisions. Even though I find the reality, the realism with which they depict this life that the characters live, this blue-collar grind, the reality which they depict it is fascinating. It's great to have that kind of fly on the wall viewpoint on their lives. I think I just never felt it compelling enough. And that's not because it needed to be sensational. It's not because I needed more, more in terms of the evils of management, or more focus on the perils of putting a spotlight to the safety conditions. It wasn't that. It wasn't the degree to which I didn't find it compelling wasn't in any relation to a lack of dramatic tension or dramatic spikes. I think perhaps it was just, and this again goes to the subjective nature of film. It's just that story, her story. It's interesting to watch. It's interesting to see them depict it, but it personally didn't compel me. And I think that what draws people to Karen Silkwood's story, her life story, is a lot of that's tied into how it ended. And to me, I'm watching it and I'm detaching that from her life story. The fact that she died this kind of, vague death. And what I'm left with, again, I enjoy watching it. It was never boring. It was never a dull film. But I just don't know that her story speaks enough to me that I would feel compelled to tell it. It's definitely not a narrative that I would have been like, oh yeah, I want to make this into a movie. Again, this is all subjective. Who am I? Someone else. Obviously, a lot of people felt differently. It was a big hit, and I don't know. It falls into that kind of category of movie that sometimes I watch and I'm like, yeah, that was solid. I felt that way when I watched The Departed. That's a movie I always think about, the Martin Scorsese movie, as like a solid movie. I saw that and I was like, yeah, it was solid. I'm not gonna go around and say, oh man, that was so good. Nor am I like, oh man, that sucked. It's a solid movie. Solid. I was interested. Had some funny parts, some good quotes, great cast. Solid. And I feel that way with Silk. Like, yeah, it's a solid. It's a really, really engrossing picture of, this certain type of life, the ends with a shadowy car crash. Yeah, I think too that little things. The music score really didn't do much for me. It was kind of a bit too much on the nose at the beginning with kind of like banjo music, which I get it. They're out in Oklahoma and they're poor people, and I get it, banjo music. Um, and then as the music as the score broke away from that into other types of compositions, it was just on whatever. Yeah. So that was a tiny little thing. Visually, I would say that it's definitely unpretentious. It's very straightforward. Mike Nichols, the way he directs it, which again, I think that that's fine. It's kind of neither here nor there. I think that he did a solid directing. There, I'll refer to that word again. Solid directing. I guess what you're left with is in the final totality of things is it does what it's supposed to do. I do like that it didn't. I do like, even though it wasn't what I expected, and that it didn't try to turn her into like a crusader. That it didn't try to take Silkwood and say, okay, she's a crusader, or she's this. They kind of left it ambiguous. I like that they didn't try to make her the poster child for workers' rights, like the Rosie the Riveter of plutonium pellets. Um, that they kind of just show her going through the actions of advocating for the rights without trying to necessarily say, oh, she's doing this for this reason because she's truly cares about this on the deepest of soul searching levels, or is it something that's kind of like maybe she's kind of gives some thought to, but she's also thinking about um, if she can get overtime this weekend, or how's she going to see her kids. So I like that approach, and it wasn't what I was expecting, but again, you're going to have expectations when you go into a movie. I think it really is about being able to let go of those. People say, like I said, people say go into a movie and don't have expectations. That's impossible. I'm a human being, and so are you. But I think the thing that you need to do when you watch a movie is when you need to be able to let go of those expectations. Have them to as little degree as possible, and as soon as you can let go of them, let go of them. Once you, especially like, when you're watching a movie like this, where it could almost threaten you what you take away from the movie, because if you really hold on to that, the idea that this movie's going to be like this, like suspenseful, this kind of the man versus the common worker kind of film with a boogeyman, corporate boogeyman around every corner, and you're not getting that, then you might walk away from this film and say, oh man, it sucked, it was boring, it was this, it was that. And no, it's just not what you went into expecting. So I think it's really important to differentiate between a movie that doesn't do its job and a movie that doesn't do the job you want it to do. And so I think that with Silkwood, I'm glad I watched it. It was definitely a well spent 130 minutes, and I think the thing again that really speaks about it more than anything else, speaks to its abilities, is the three performances. Again, these are completely sinking into these roles. You don't watch it and think, oh yeah, this is Kurt Russell and Cher and Meryl Streep. You think it's the characters, the real life characters. But at the same time, I wouldn't, it's not in that category of, oh, that's a must-see movie. You got it, you got to see Silkwood. Yeah, I'm still processing it. Like I said, I just watched it last night, thinking about it throughout the day. Trying to kind of figure out, and I think what I feel about it. That's the thing about movies, is sometimes it's a process of just trying to understand your relationship with a movie. Some films, it's a lot easier to know why you like or dislike certain parts of it, what speaks to you, what doesn't. And I think with Silkwood, it's really a mixture of things. It's a mixed bag for me. It's a mixed bag because you have these great performances and this really engrossing, detailed look at the life of these type of workers lead. But at the same time, there seems to be kind of like a little bit excess of time spent on that, even though the quality of their depiction of the life of these characters, the quality of the depiction of it is strong. There's a little bit too much time spent on it. I think it's a mixed bag in terms of like it's it doesn't try to be showboaty in its visual presentation, but at the same time, it's kind of like, but then the music's kind of weak. Um, I don't know. I think you could almost make the argument too that the actual crises she faces at this plant in terms of safety, the plutonium exposure that the workers might face, you could almost make the argument that that's really one of the less compelling aspects of the movie, which you'd think would be like in a movie about someone who is fighting for workplace safety at a nuclear facility, and the dangers that we associate with that, and especially this movie coming out in '83, only a few years after the China Syndrome, and I think what was that, the same year as the day after, and all the nuclear radioactive fear mongering at the time. You'd think that would kind of be what you're going to expect to be the strong point, but it's kind of more like, I think you could, say that their reaction to working in an environment like this, how they handle it. For example, there's a couple scenes where people get contaminated and they get scrubbed down and really aggressively scrubbed down in a shower with this like stiff brush going over their skin. You can see their skin turning red just from the brush going over it. The fear that this one coworker of Silkwood's, this older woman, that she has, that she's going to get cancer from being contaminated. The way in which Streep's character kind of starts exploring the topics of workplace danger and kind of starts to educate herself about it. But again, like I said, you don't know necessarily how deep this runs. I think those things are kind of more compelling in this film than the actual threats themselves. It's the way people respond to the threats and the way people handle it and the way it kind of intersects with their everyday life. I think that was kind of more compelling than the threats themselves. It's interesting because it's a very tiny thing in the film. There's a part where Silkwood, she's talking about this coworker of hers who I just mentioned, who was exposed, contaminated, and her concern about her, whether or not the company gave her proper testing to see if she's going to be okay. And one of her coworkers, this guy played by Kent Broadhurst, a really familiar character actor, he kind of starts being a dick to her. Not super aggressive, but just like why do you care? It's not a big deal, that kind of thing. And in that moment, like, there's this tangible sense of like disgust, distaste between them, because he's being a dick. And then shortly after that, there's a scene where they have a birthday party where Karen brings in or Cher, one of them, brings in a cake for a different coworker, this woman who they're friends with. And in that scene, Streep's character and that guy who's addicted to her, they're getting along. Like, she cuts off has like a piece of cake and kind of like gives it to him or something. Like, she's being playful with him. And that little aspect of the film, I thought it's one of the scenes of the film that stuck with me more than almost anything else, because it's so realistic. Like, people, maybe it's this way at all jobs, I'm sure it is, even white collar jobs, but you'll have people who really, 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 especially in an industrial setting with like the physical stresses and the fact that no one is really there because they desire this kind of life. There aren't too many people at my warehouse, myself included, who, were kids and were like, oh, when I grow up, I want to work at a warehouse, Mom. We're there for all the wrong reasons, and basically have no one to blame but ourselves. But there is definitely, you see this a lot where people at a job like that, they really won't get along. Like, they really will have a moment or an hour or a day where they really won't get along with someone else. And then, like, the next day, they'll be joking around and playing like nothing happened. And it's not because they had some kind of awakening, right? It's not like because they had some kind of, like, vision where they're like, oh, man, we as human beings should get along with each other and let's talk and reason out what our difference is. No, it's totally not that at all. It's totally the opposite. It's just like, well, this is a different day, and I'm just not, I'm just going to, as long as this day's going well, I'll be nice to this person. Maybe tomorrow I'll be a dick to them again if that day doesn't go well. It's kind of like this almost like second to second existence of where your relationship with your coworkers is defined really by like what's going on at that minute, what's going on at that second between you two, more than it is any kind of broader, deeper understanding of improving relationships and building relationships. And that's something that's really it's part of human existence. Obviously it's not, but I think it's really something that I see a lot at this type of job, because I think it just speaks to the nature of that job. And I thought that was a really, again, kind of spoke to the film's ability to really, really portray this kind of life. Again, even though this you take the 100-foot stare at this film and its narrative, I don't know that it's compelling enough. Again, like in the way that I said that film Derby was. But when it does show this kind of life, it does it well. It's kind of like that Paul Newman quote from a movie he did, The Young Philadelphians. It was something like he plays a lawyer in that film, and at the end of the movie, he says something like, "Well, I didn't turn out as well as I wanted to as a person, but it could have been worse too." And I feel like that's this movie. Like, it could have been maybe it could have been something better, but it was still solid. Solid. We're gonna go back to that word. Solid. Silkwood was solid. You can use a pull quote on that if you ever want to. Underneath Silkwood, it just says solid in quotes, and then David Weaver, director of Last Frankenstein. But yeah, I definitely think, definitely check it out. Why not? Check it out. Check it out if you can. This was put out on Blu-ray by Kino Lorber, which is now out of print. It was produced by ABC Motion Pictures, which was the theatrical arm of ABC. And of course, Disney eventually bought out all the ABC. They own ABC now as part of the Mouse House. And Kino Lorber, when they had a deal with Disney, was able to license this as one of many Disney-owned properties they were able to acquire. Disney has historically been okay with licensing out their product that's not Disney branded. The other stuff they make, like Hollywood Pictures, Touchstone Pictures, ABC Pictures, that stuff they're more copacetic to licensing out. But at some point, around the time of Disney Plus getting launched, the streaming service, they kind of clamped down on all the licensing out of titles. So, Kino Lorber has been up front. They've been like, we have some movies we've put out from our Disney deal, like the Night Stalker movies with Darren McGavin. We'd love to keep those out. We don't want to make them go out of print, but our initial deal has expired. They're not interested in relicensing, and so a lot of those titles are going out of print. And I don't know if Silkwood was one that they would have relicensed if available, or if it's just falling by the wayside because of that. But hopefully that will change the dealings with Disney, that they'll be more open to licensing again in the future. There are some signs that maybe that's happening. So I don't think you can find this movie streaming anywhere. I actually went to look. I just wanted to rewatch a couple parts of it real quick, and I was too lazy to walk into the other room and put my Blu-ray back in. So I was like, I'll just look online real quick, and I don't think it's streaming anywhere. So I did have to walk into the other room and put that Blu-ray back in. You bet your life I did. But yeah, check it out if you get your hands on the Blu-ray. You can probably still find it on eBay. Not too bad. It's got a bunch of trailers. It has an interview with the producer, like a little under 20-minute interview with the producer on the film, which is definitely worth checking out. So Silkwood is solid. I think that wraps it up. This is for our third episode of Carpet City Cinema. Probably next week I'll have deeper thoughts on Silkwood. But I probably won't remember to share them with you, so whatever. I should probably have a disclaimer on these episodes. Don't hold me to my opinions of the movie they may change more than 5 minutes after I say them. But no. So thank you anyways. Thank you for checking in on this. We'll be back next week. Hopefully be that much closer to locking things up for the DVD and Blu-ray of The Last Frankenstein. Anything you can do to keep spreading the word about Carpet City Cinema. Again, we are on Facebook. So give us a like there, like our post there. Tell people about it. We are on Spotify, and we are on iTunes. And shoot us an email too if you want. carpetcitycinema@gilafilm.com, gila-film.com. So that's Carpet City Cinema, one word, at Gila, GILA-film, FILM.com. All right. Thank you very much, and take care.